The Godfather is one of the greatest films ever made. The Corleones have a code. They have loyalty. They have rules about who can be touched and who cannot. Violence is a last resort, carried out with reluctance, and even the darkest moments in the film carry a kind of dignity that makes the whole thing feel almost noble. The real Mafia bosses who inspired those characters had none of that. The real men ran murder corporations out of candy stores. They had civilians killed for appearing on television. They committed murders while literally on the FBI payroll. They killed their own bosses, made deals with their replacements, and killed those bosses too. They plotted with the CIA to assassinate foreign leaders. They were shot dead by men they cooked dinner for. No honor, no code, no dignity. What you are about to hear is what these men actually did, and why the reality was so much worse than anything that ever made it onto a movie screen. Section 1. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner. In The Godfather, the Corleones have a rule. You do not kill innocent people. You do not drag civilians into the business. There is a code, and the code means something. The real Mafia had rules too. Albert Anastasia just ignored all of them whenever he felt like it. Anastasia arrived in New York in 1919 at 17 years old, jumping off a ship in Brooklyn with nothing. 2 years later, he killed a fellow dock worker named George Torino during a dispute on the job. He was arrested, convicted, and sent to Sing Sing prison on death row. Then every single witness against him disappeared. The conviction collapsed, and Anastasia walked out of prison a free man. He would be charged with murder 3 more times over the next 12 years. Every single time the same thing happened. Witnesses vanished. Cases fell apart. He never spent a meaningful day behind bars for any of it. Lucky Luciano noticed this. A man who could kill people and make witnesses disappear was exactly the kind of man Luciano needed. So after Luciano took control of New York's criminal underworld in 1931, he handed Anastasia and a man named Louis Lepka Buckhalter something that had never existed before in American crime: a dedicated, full-time, for-hire murder operation. What they built became known as Murder Incorporated. It operated out of the back room of a candy store, Midnight Roses on Saratoga Avenue in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Open 24 hours. Killers would sit in the back drinking coffee, playing cards, waiting for the phone to ring. They were paid a weekly salary, around $125, plus extra for each completed job. They had one standing rule: never kill in your own neighborhood. Everything else was fair game. That operation ran for roughly 10 years. In that time, law enforcement and historians estimate it carried out somewhere between 400 and 1,000 murders. Not 400 to 1,000 fights, not 400 to 1,000 beatings. Murders. Contracted, assigned, and carried out like any other job. Most were never solved. Most of the victims were never publicly identified. The Corleone family in The Godfather went to war over the death of one man. Anastasia's operation was killing people at an industrial scale for a decade, and nobody on the outside even knew it existed. Anastasia ran it with an almost casual relationship to human life. He was charged with murder in 1928, again in 1932, again in 1933. Each time, witnesses either disappeared or refused to open their mouths. He earned the nickname the Lord High Executioner. He also went by the Mad Hatter. Both names fit. The closest anyone came to bringing him down was through a man named Abe Relis. Relis had been one of Murder Inc.'s most active killers, and in 1941 he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. His testimony was devastating. It cracked the entire organization open and sent multiple men to the electric chair. He was the key witness who could have finally put Anastasia in prison. On November 12, 1941, Relis fell from the 6th-floor window of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. He was under police protection at the time. There were 6 officers assigned to guard him. His body landed on a roof extension below. No officer was ever charged with anything. No explanation was ever officially established. Anastasia was never tried. In 1951, Anastasia's own boss, Vincent Mangano, disappeared. On the same day, Mangano's brother Philip was found shot dead near Jamaica Bay. Anastasia walked into a meeting of the Commission, the Mafia's governing body, and told them the Manganos had been planning to kill him first. He offered no proof. The Commission, which was made up of men who were all quietly terrified of Anastasia, confirmed him as the new boss of the family. He had almost certainly just murdered the 2 men whose positions he then took. Nobody said a word about it. Then came the moment that separated Anastasia from every fictional mob boss ever put on screen. In 1952, a civilian clothing salesman named Arnold Schuster spotted bank robber Willie Sutton on a New York City subway. Schuster reported him to police. Sutton was arrested. Schuster went on television to tell his story. Willie Sutton had zero connection to the Mafia. He was not a threat to Anastasia or anyone in his organization. He was just a bank robber. But Anastasia saw the television segment, and by all accounts, he simply could not stand the sight of a man who had cooperated with police. He ordered Arnold Schuster killed. His men carried it out. A completely innocent civilian, a man who had done nothing except report a criminal to the authorities, was murdered because a mob boss saw him on TV and did not like what he represented. Vito Corleone would never have done that. The real Anastasia did not think twice. On October 25, 1957,
Anastasia sat down in a barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for a haircut. His bodyguard had stepped outside. 2 men in scarves walked into the shop and fired 10 shots at him. Anastasia was hit multiple times. He staggered out of the chair and went for the gunmen. But in the smoke and confusion, he charged directly at their reflections in the barber mirror instead of the men themselves. He collapsed on the floor and died. He was 55 years old. No one was ever charged with his murder. Joey Gallo, a Brooklyn gangster, later boasted about his role in it, reportedly saying people could call his group the Barbershop Quintet. Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino were widely believed to have ordered the hit. Neither was ever prosecuted. Albert Anastasia ran a murder corporation from a candy store, killed a man for appearing on television, survived death row through disappearing witnesses, and was finally shot dead in a hotel barbershop. His killers were never identified. His victims numbered in the hundreds. And in 50 years of covering organized crime, Hollywood never made a character quite as dangerous or as casually violent as the real man who sat in that chair. The next boss we are covering built his entire empire in public. Suits, cameras, newspaper covers, and somehow avoided justice even longer than Anastasia did, until the one man he trusted most decided he had heard enough. Section 2. John Gotti, the Teflon Don who brought down his own empire. Most mob bosses spent their entire careers trying to stay invisible. John Gotti did the opposite. He wore $1,000 suits, held court on street corners in Queens, waved at news cameras, and threw 4th of July fireworks parties for his neighborhood every year. He wanted people to know who he was. That decision would eventually destroy him, but not before he ran the most powerful crime family in America for nearly a decade and beat the federal government in court 3 separate times. Gotti grew up poor in the South Bronx and later Queens, one of 13 children. He dropped out of high school at 16 and fell in with a Gambino crime family as a teenager. By his early 20s, he was running illegal gambling operations and hijacking trucks near JFK Airport. In 1968,
The FBI arrested him along with his brother Gene and a childhood friend for 3 cargo thefts and truck hijackings. He pleaded guilty and served 3 years in federal prison. He came out and went straight back to work. His first confirmed murder came in May 1973. A man named James McBratney had been part of a crew kidnapping members of the Gambino family for ransom. Gambino boss Carlo Gambino wanted him dead. Gotti and 2 others tracked McBratney to a bar on Staten Island. They tried to grab him while posing as police detectives. McBratney resisted. One of Gotti's associates shot him dead in front of witnesses. Gotti was identified, arrested, and charged. His attorney at the time was Roy Cohn, the same powerful New York lawyer who had connections running through decades of American politics. Gotti plea bargained down to attempted manslaughter and served 4 years. When he came out in 1977, he was a rising figure in the Gambino family under underboss Aniello Della Croce, who mentored him and gave him increasing responsibility. By the early 1980s, Gotti was one of the family's biggest earners and most feared captains. He was also violating one of the family's most important rules: dealing narcotics. Gambino boss Paul Castellano had explicitly banned drug dealing across the entire organization, threatening death to anyone who broke that rule. Gotti's crew was dealing heroin anyway. When Della Croce died of cancer in December 1985, the last person standing between Gotti and Castellano's anger was gone. Gotti believed Castellano was about to have him killed for the drug dealing. Whether that was true or not, Gotti moved first. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano arrived at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan for a dinner meeting. As he stepped out of his car, 4 men in trench coats and fur hats shot him dead on the sidewalk. His driver and bodyguard, Thomas Bilotti, was shot dead at the same moment. Gotti and Gravano were parked nearby, watching it happen. The hit had not been approved by the other New York families. It was one of the most brazen, unsanctioned mob murders in decades, carried out on a busy Midtown Manhattan street during the Christmas shopping season. 2 weeks later, Gotti was recognized as the new boss of the Gambino family. The family at that point had 23 active crews, around 300 made members, and more than 2,000 associates. Investigators estimated it was generating around $500 million a year. Then came the part that made Gotti famous. The federal government tried to prosecute him 3 times in the 1980s. They failed every time. One case collapsed because a juror was paid a $60,000 bribe. Other cases fell apart through witness intimidation. The press gave him the nickname the Teflon Don because nothing stuck. Gotti loved it. He gave more interviews. He stood outside his social club in Mulberry Street in Little Italy and let photographers take his picture. He was the first mob boss in American history to actively court the media, and for a few years, it worked. What he did not know was that the FBI had installed listening devices inside the Ravenite Social Club, where he held regular meetings with his captains. Everything was being recorded, and some of what was recorded included Gotti making disparaging remarks about his own underboss, Salvatore Gravano, known as Sammy the Bull, blaming him for murders that both men had been involved in together. Gravano heard the tapes. He made a decision. In November 1991, he became a government witness, the highest-ranking member of a New York crime family to ever turn informant up to that point.
He agreed to testify about everything: the murders, the racketeering, the structure of the organization, all of it. The trial began in January 1992. For the first time, the jury was fully anonymous and sequestered.
a direct response to Gotti's history of jury tampering. He could not get to them. On April 2, 1992, Gotti was convicted on all 13 counts against him: murder, racketeering, extortion, jury tampering, obstruction of justice. On June 23, 1992, he was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. FBI Special Agent James Fox stood outside the courthouse that day and said, "The Teflon is gone. The Don is covered in Velcro, and all the charges stuck." Gotti was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the most restrictive federal prisons in the country. He was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1998. On June 10, 2002, he died at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. He had spent the last decade of his life in a cell. Gravano, the man whose testimony put him there, received a 5-year sentence and was released. He later moved to Arizona under a new identity, where he was arrested again in 2000 for running an ecstasy distribution ring. The Teflon Don built his empire in public and lost it the same way, on tape, in his own voice, saying things he should never have said about the one man who had the power to destroy him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next boss we cover never made that mistake. He stayed completely invisible, served almost no prison time across a 50-year criminal career, and died peacefully at home while still running the most powerful crime family in the country. Section 3. Whitey Bulger, the FBI's partner in murder. The Godfather ends with Michael Corleone becoming the most powerful man in the room.
Law enforcement circles around him, but can never quite touch him. It feels like fiction. What happened in Boston for nearly 2 decades was not fiction, and it was worse. A crime boss named James Bulger did not just evade law enforcement. He had law enforcement working for him, tipping him off about witnesses, protecting him from prosecution, and effectively helping him murder people. And it went on for years before anyone on the outside figured out what was happening. Bulger grew up in a South Boston housing project, one of several children in an Irish immigrant family. His brother William would go on to serve 25 years in the Massachusetts State Senate and later become president of the University of Massachusetts. Whitey went a different direction. He was arrested for the first time at 14. He cycled in and out of trouble through his teens and 20s, eventually being convicted of bank robbery and sent to federal prison. He served time at Leavenworth and Alcatraz before being paroled in 1965. He returned to Boston and worked his way into the Winter Hill Gang, a predominantly Irish criminal organization based in Somerville, Massachusetts. By 1979, the gang's leadership had been arrested for fixing horse races at tracks across the East Coast. Bulger stepped into the vacuum and took over. He was 50 years old and already one of the most feared men in Boston's underworld. What almost nobody knew at the time was that Bulger had been an FBI informant since at least 1975. His handler was a man named John Connolly, an FBI agent who had grown up in the same South Boston housing project as the Bulger family. Connolly had known Whitey since he was a child. He idolized him. When Connolly joined the FBI and was assigned to organized crime work in Boston, he recruited Bulger as a top-echelon informant, the highest level of confidential source the Bureau maintained. The arrangement was supposed to work like this. Bulger would feed the FBI information about the Italian Patriarca crime family, his main rivals in Boston, and in return, the FBI would have a valuable intelligence source inside the criminal underworld. What it actually became was something else entirely. Bulger gave the FBI just enough information to keep them satisfied. In return, Connolly gave Bulger everything. The names of informants who were talking about him, details of investigations being built against his organization, warnings about imminent arrests. And when Bulger used that information to have people killed, Connolly looked the other way. Connolly's supervisor, John Morris, was also compromised. Morris accepted bribes from Bulger, including cash and airline tickets for his girlfriend. By 1982, according to court findings, Morris was thoroughly compromised. The FBI's organized crime squad in Boston was not investigating Bulger. It was protecting him. The clearest example of what this protection meant in human terms involved a man named Brian Halloran. Halloran was a South Boston cocaine dealer who approached the FBI in 1982 with information about a murder he had witnessed, a killing involving Bulger. Halloran was asking for witness protection in exchange for his cooperation. Connolly found out and immediately told Bulger that Halloran was talking to the FBI. On May 11, 1982, Bulger's associates staked out a restaurant on Northern Avenue where Halloran was having dinner. When Halloran left, he was shot dead on the street. A man named Michael Donahue, who had simply offered Halloran a ride home that evening, was also killed. Donahue had no criminal record and no involvement in anything. He was murdered because he was in the wrong car at the wrong moment. And he was in that car because the FBI told Bulger his passenger was a problem. Connolly was later convicted of second-degree murder for his role in leaking Halloran's identity. Over 2 decades, Bulger used his FBI protection to systematically eliminate rivals and build a criminal empire across eastern Massachusetts, covering drug dealing, bookmaking, loan sharking, arms trafficking, and extortion. The FBI, meanwhile, was using Bulger's tips to dismantle the Patriarca family, which collapsed under a series of prosecutions in the 1980s. The Bureau eliminated Bulger's competition for him and called it good police work. In December 1994, the DEA, the Massachusetts State Police, and the Boston Police Department had built a genuine RICO case against Bulger. Crucially, they had kept the FBI out of the investigation because they believed the Boston field office was compromised. They were right. Connolly found out the indictments were coming anyway and warned Bulger. Bulger packed a bag, took his girlfriend, Catherine Gregg, and disappeared. He spent the next 16 years on the run. He made the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and at one point sat at number 2 on that list, behind only Osama bin Laden. There was a $2 million reward for information leading to his capture. In June 2011, the FBI ran a public service announcement on television focused specifically on Gregg rather than Bulger, targeting female viewers who might have encountered her at a salon or doctor's office. Within days, tips came in placing the pair in Santa Monica, California, where they had been living quietly in a rent-controlled apartment under the names Charles and Carol Gasco. Agents arrested Bulger in the garage of his building. He had $800,000 in cash hidden in the walls of his apartment, along with numerous firearms and fake identification documents. At his 2013 trial, Bulger was convicted on 31 of 32 counts against him, including participating in 11 murders. Judge Denise Casper told him at sentencing that the scope, the callousness, and the depravity of his crimes were almost unfathomable. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. On October 30th, 2018,
Less than 12 hours after being transferred to the United States Penitentiary Hazleton in West Virginia, Bulger was beaten to death in his cell. He was 89 years old. His attackers reportedly gouged out his eyes, a punishment the mob traditionally reserved for informants. The man who had spent decades calling other people rats died being treated like one. The next boss we cover never needed the FBI to protect him. He stayed clean on paper, moved quietly, and in 50 years of running one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history, served a total of 22 months in prison. Section 4. Carlo Gambino, the quiet Don who ran everything and served almost no time. The most dangerous man in any room is rarely the loudest one. Carlo Gambino understood this better than anyone who ever ran organized crime in America. While Anastasia was murdering civilians and Gotti was posing for newspaper photos, Gambino spent nearly 2 decades as the most powerful criminal figure in the United States without most Americans even knowing what he looked like. He was arrested 16 times across a 50-year career. He served 22 months in prison. He died at home in his bed at 74 years old, still the boss, still untouchable. Gambino was born in Palermo, Sicily on August 24, 1902, into a family that already had deep roots in the Sicilian Mafia. He was not just a man who got involved in organized crime, he was born into it. By the time he was a teenager, he was already connected, already being groomed, already learning how power worked and how to keep it. He entered the United States in 1921 as a ship stowaway, technically an illegal immigrant. He was never prosecuted for it. He never would be. He settled in Brooklyn and went to work for the criminal organization that would eventually take his name. He worked under a succession of bosses through the 1920s and 1930s,
Surviving the Castellamarese War, the bloody 2-year conflict between rival mafia factions that reshaped New York's criminal landscape in 1930 and 1931, by consistently being on the right side at the right time. That was a pattern that would define his entire career. Gambino had an almost supernatural ability to sense which way the wind was blowing before anyone else did. His only meaningful criminal conviction came in 1937 for running an illegal liquor still. He served 22 months. The conviction was later reversed on appeal because of unconstitutional wiretapping procedures used by investigators. After that, the government never put him behind bars again. Not for lack of trying. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, Gambino worked his way up through the family then controlled by Vincent Mangano. When Mangano was murdered in 1951, almost certainly on the orders of Albert Anastasia, who then took over, Gambino became Anastasia's underboss. He watched Anastasia run the family with reckless, impulsive violence. He took notes, and then he helped get rid of him. In 1957, Gambino aligned with Vito Genovese against Anastasia. On October 25th of that year, Anastasia was shot dead in a Midtown Manhattan barber chair. Gambino took over the family. He was 55 years old and had spent decades learning exactly how not to run a criminal organization. Now he applied everything he knew. His approach was the opposite of every flashy mob boss before and after him. He kept an extremely low profile. He discouraged unnecessary violence. He was known for offering FBI agents coffee and dessert when they showed up at his door with arrest warrants, before calmly accompanying them to be booked, and then walking free again. He understood that visibility was the enemy. The more people talked about you, the more pressure law enforcement was under to do something about you. He built the Gambino family into the most powerful criminal organization in the country through patience and structure rather than spectacle. The family took control of labor unions across the New York and New Jersey waterfront, at JFK Airport, and across major construction and trucking operations throughout the city. Bookmaking, loan sharking, extortion, and hijacking produced enormous revenue. The operation was vast, profitable, and quiet. On the narcotics question, Gambino instituted what was known internally as a deal and die policy. Anyone in his organization caught dealing drugs would be killed. This was not a moral position. It was a business calculation. Drug charges carried long sentences, and long sentences gave prosecutors leverage to flip informants. He wanted none of that pressure inside his organization. He also understood the value of family in a literal sense. He married his son to the daughter of Lucchese family boss Tommy Three-Finger Brown Lucchese, cementing an alliance between two of the most powerful families in New York through blood rather than just business.
His cousin and brother-in-law was Paul Castellano, who ran some of the family's most profitable operations. Gambino built a web of personal loyalty around himself that made him extraordinarily difficult to attack from any direction. In 1970, the FBI indicted him for masterminding a major East Coast burglary ring. The case fell apart. In 1972, his nephew, Manny Gambino, was kidnapped by an Irish mob crew that had been grabbing Italian mobsters for ransom for over a year. The family paid part of the ransom. The kidnappers killed Manny anyway and buried his body in a New Jersey landfill. Gambino called on a young, ambitious captain named John Gotti to track down the man responsible, a criminal named James McBratney. Gotti found him and had him killed. It was one of the moments that put Gotti on the path to eventually running the family himself.
Gambino was never deported, despite entering the country illegally. He was never convicted of anything that stuck. He was investigated constantly, and prosecuted effectively, never. When he died of a heart attack at his home in Massapequa, New York on October 15, 1976, he was still the boss. The family he left behind was worth hundreds of millions of dollars and controlled operations across the entire eastern seaboard. He appointed his brother-in-law Paul Castellano as his successor, bypassing his longtime underboss, Aniello Della Croce, a decision that created a rift inside the family that would eventually result in Castellano being shot dead outside a steakhouse 9 years later. Even Gambino's last act of power contained the seed of the violence that followed it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next boss we cover never had Gambino's patience or his discipline. He wanted to be the boss of all bosses. He wanted everyone to know it, and the catastrophic meeting he organized to announce that fact ended up exposing the entire American Mafia to law enforcement scrutiny for the first time in history. Section 5. Sam Giancana, the boss who dined with presidents and plotted with the CIA. There is a scene in The Godfather where the heads of the 5 families sit down together in a wood-paneled room and negotiate the future of organized crime in America. It feels like the most powerful moment in the film. The real Sam Giancana did not sit in rooms like that. He sat in the White House. He shared a girlfriend with a sitting president. He was recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency to assassinate a foreign head of state. And then he was shot 6 times in the head in his own basement while cooking sausage the night before he was supposed to testify before the United States Senate. Giancana was born Salvatore Giancana on June 15, 1908 in Chicago to Sicilian immigrant parents. He grew up in a neighborhood called The Patch on the city's west side. His father ran an Italian ice business from a pushcart. As a direct result of his son's criminal activities, that business was firebombed twice. The family paid the price for what Giancana was becoming while he was still a teenager. He joined a street crew called the 42 Gang as a young man. The name was a reference to Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. They considered themselves 2 better. Giancana proved himself quickly as a getaway driver, an extortionist, and a killer. He was arrested for the first time in 1925 for auto theft. By the time he was 20, he had been the primary subject of 3 separate murder investigations and had never been tried for any of them. The 42 Gang functioned as a feeder organization for the Chicago Outfit, the city's organized crime apparatus, built originally by Al Capone. Giancana was absorbed into the outfit and spent the 1930s and 1940s working his way up through its ranks. He became known for 2 things: his ability to generate money and his complete willingness to use violence to solve any problem. He earned the nickname Momo, slang suggesting he was slightly unhinged,
and also went by Mooney. Both names acknowledged the same quality. He was unpredictable in a way that made even other criminals nervous. By the late 1940s, Giancana was the right hand of outfit boss Tony Accardo. He engineered a violent takeover of Chicago's African-American lottery operations on the South Side, bringing millions of dollars a year into the outfit's coffers. That success was a major factor in what happened next. In 1957, Accardo stepped back from daily operations, and Giancana was installed as the front boss of the Chicago outfit. That same year, he attended the Appalachian Summit in upstate New York, the national gathering of American mob bosses that was raided by state police, exposing the existence of a nationwide criminal organization to law enforcement and the public for the first time. Before attending, Giancana had reportedly told associates that Chicago was the safest place in the world for a major underworld meeting, because he had several police chiefs on his personal payroll. He went to New York anyway. The relationship with the Kennedy family is one of the most debated chapters in American political history, and also one of the most documented. Giancana and the Chicago outfit were widely linked to efforts to deliver Illinois for John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election, a state Kennedy won by an extremely narrow margin. Giancana also shared a girlfriend named Judith Campbell Exner with Kennedy during this period. Exner later confirmed the relationships publicly, stating she had been simultaneously involved with both men. Almost immediately after Kennedy's election, his brother Robert Kennedy, appointed Attorney General, launched an aggressive federal campaign against organized crime. Giancana found himself under constant FBI surveillance. Agents followed him everywhere, including onto golf courses, standing one foursome behind him as he played his rounds. He sued the FBI over the surveillance in 1963. He won a partial court order limiting how closely they could follow him, which was an almost unprecedented legal victory for a sitting mob boss. At the same time, the CIA had approached Giancana and fellow mob boss Santo Trafficante Jr. about assassinating Cuban leader Fidel Castro, who had expelled the Mafia from Cuba after his 1959 revolution. The outfit had run highly profitable casino operations in Havana before Castro took power. Giancana agreed to participate in the CIA plot. The intermediary was a Chicago outfit associate named Johnny Rosselli. Multiple assassination attempts were planned. None succeeded. Castro outlived virtually everyone involved in trying to kill him. In 1965,
Giancana was jailed for contempt of court after refusing to testify before a Senate subcommittee investigating organized crime. He served 1 year. When he came out, the national mafia leadership had lost patience with the attention his celebrity lifestyle was generating. Accardo and senior outfit figure Paul Ricca removed him as boss. He was replaced by Joseph Ayupa. Giancana relocated to Mexico and spent 7 years living in a villa in Cuernavaca. In 1974, Mexican authorities arrested him and deported him back to the United States. He returned to Chicago and attended a sit-down with Accardo and other senior outfit figures. He refused to share the money he had made from offshore casino interests during his years in Mexico. That refusal made powerful enemies inside his own organization. In 1975, Giancana was subpoenaed to testify before the Church Committee, a Senate investigation into the CIA's assassination plots and the Mafia's involvement in them. He was scheduled to appear within days. On the night of June 19, 1975, Giancana was in the basement kitchen of his Oak Park home cooking a late meal of sausage, escarole, and beans. He had let someone he knew into the house. That person shot him once in the back of the head, then 5 more times in the face and neck. He was 67 years old. FBI records obtained decades later by NBC, Chicago state that Tony Accardo personally carried out the killing.
A mob hitman told the FBI in a recorded interview that Accardo was involved in the homicide of Giancana. The murder weapon was found in a forest preserve located between Giancana's house and Accardo's home in River Forest. Accardo died of natural causes in 1992. No one was ever charged with Giancana's murder. The next boss we cover did not need violence to accumulate power. He killed 2 bosses in the same year, abolished the title of boss of all bosses, and then built a governing structure for organized crime that has outlasted every single person who ever sat inside it.
Section 6. Lucky Luciano, the man who invented the modern mafia. Every criminal organization in The Godfather operates inside a structure. There are families, there are bosses, there are rules about who can be killed and who cannot. That structure did not come from a movie. It came from one man who built it in 1931 after murdering his way to the top twice in the same year. Charles Luciano, known to everyone as Lucky, did not just run organized crime in America. He designed it. The system he created is still functionally operating today. Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania on November 24, 1897, in Lercara Fridi, Sicily. His family moved to New York City when he was 10 years old and settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. By his early teens, he was already involved in street gangs and petty crime. By his 20s, he was working for Giuseppe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, the most powerful criminal figure in New York at the time. Masseria was what older Italian mobsters called a mustache Pete. He was traditional, rigid, suspicious of anyone who was not Sicilian, and completely unwilling to work with Jewish or Irish criminal organizations, even when doing so would have made everyone more money. Luciano found this thinking outdated and limiting. He had already formed close working relationships with Jewish gangsters Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and he understood that organized crime could be far more profitable if it functioned less like an old-world ethnic fraternity and more like a modern business corporation. The problem was that 2 men stood between Luciano and the ability to build what he was envisioning. His own boss, Masseria, was one of them. Salvatore Maranzano, Masseria's rival, who was fighting Masseria for control of New York in a bloody conflict known as the Castellamarese War, was the other. Luciano's solution was to betray both of them. He secretly made a deal with Maranzano while still working for Masseria. He would arrange Masseria's death in exchange for taking over Masseria's rackets and becoming Maranzano's second in command. On April 15, 1931, Luciano took Masseria to a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro in Coney Island. They ate together and played cards. At some point during the meal, Luciano excused himself to use the bathroom. While he was gone, 4 gunmen walked into the restaurant. Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Bugsy Siegel, and Joe Adonis shot Masseria dead at the table. The getaway driver, a man named Ciro Terranova, was reportedly so shaken by what he had just witnessed that he could not make his hands work the steering wheel. Bugsy Siegel shoved him out of the seat and drove away himself. Maranzano took over, reorganized New York's gangs into the 5 families, and declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He gave Luciano the position he had been promised. Then he immediately began planning to have Luciano killed anyway, hiring an Irish gangster named Vincent Mad Dog Call to carry out the murder. Luciano found out through his associate Tommy Lucchese. He moved first. On September 10, 1931, less than 5 months after Masseria's murder, Maranzano summoned Luciano and Vito Genovese to his office on the 9th floor of 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan.
Luciano understood what the meeting was. Instead of attending himself, he sent 4 Jewish gangsters whose faces were completely unknown to Maranzano's men. They arrived at the office disguised as government agents, flashed badges, and disarmed Maranzano's bodyguards. Lucchese was present to point Maranzano out. The men entered his private office and stabbed him multiple times before shooting him. Maranzano died on the floor of his own office. Luciano had now killed 2 bosses in 5 months. He was 33 years old. What he did next was the most consequential decision in the history of American organized crime. Rather than declare himself boss of all bosses, a title that had now gotten 2 men killed in rapid succession, he abolished it entirely. He called a meeting of crime bosses in Chicago and proposed the Commission, a governing body made up of the leaders of the major American crime families, designed to resolve disputes, divide territory, and prevent the kind of bloody wars that had been destabilizing the underworld for years. The bosses agreed. The commission was established with 7 founding members, including the leaders of New York's 5 families, the Chicago outfit under Al Capone, and the Buffalo crime family under Stefano Magaddino. It was, in practical terms, the moment organized crime in America became a functioning institution rather than a collection of warring gangs. Luciano ran his family and maintained quiet supremacy over the commission through the early 1930s. Then, in 1936, ambitious New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey convicted him on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution, running a network of brothels across the city. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in state prison. He continued running his organization from inside Clinton Correctional Facility. During World War II, the United States Navy approached him for help. German submarines were attacking American ships along the East Coast, and there were fears of Axis sabotage on the New York waterfront, which Luciano's organization effectively controlled through its stranglehold on the longshoremen's unions. Luciano cooperated. The waterfront was secured. In 1946, New York Governor Thomas Dewey, the same man who had prosecuted him, commuted his sentence on the condition that he be deported to Italy. Luciano left America and never legally returned. From Italy, he continued operating as an elder statesman of the American Mafia, holding a major meeting of mob bosses in Havana, Cuba in 1946, with Frank Sinatra present as entertainment, before American government pressure forced the Cuban authorities to deport him back to Italy. He died of a heart attack at Naples Airport on January 26, 1962. He was 64 years old. The commission he created in 1931 continued operating for decades after his death. The 5 families structure he established still exists in New York today. He built a corporation out of murder and ran it from a prison cell and then a foreign country. No fictional Godfather in any movie has ever come close to what he actually did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next boss we cover inherited a version of that structure and then used his position inside it to pursue a level of personal ambition so reckless that he accidentally forced the entire American Mafia out of the shadows and into public view for the first time in history. Section 7. Vito Genovese, the man who accidentally destroyed the Mafia's golden age. Vito Genovese spent 30 years clawing his way to the top of American organized crime. He murdered rivals, fled to another continent, befriended a fascist dictator, returned to America, murdered more rivals, and finally seized control of the most powerful criminal organization in the country. Then, in the space of 2 years, through pure overreach, he triggered a chain of events that permanently crippled the institution he had spent his entire life trying to control. No enemy did more damage to the American Mafia than Vito Genovese. He did it to himself. Genovese was born on November 27, 1897, in a small village called Tufino near Naples, Italy. His family immigrated to New York City in 1913 when he was 15. They settled in Manhattan's Little Italy neighborhood. He completed school only to the equivalent of 5th grade. By 19, he had his first conviction: 1 year in prison for illegal possession of a firearm.
Shortly after his release, he met Charles "Lucky" Luciano in the neighborhood, and the two became close. That friendship would shape the next 4 decades of both their lives. Through the 1920s, Genovese worked alongside Luciano under Joe Masseria, earning a reputation as a reliable and completely ruthless enforcer. He was present at Masseria's murder in April 1931 and at the planning of Maranzano's murder 5 months later. When Luciano built the commission and established the 5 families, Genovese became his underboss, the second most powerful position in what was then the largest and most profitable crime family in New York. In 1936, Luciano went to prison on prostitution charges. Genovese became acting boss. He held the position for less than a year. In January 1937, facing prosecution for the 1934 murder of a man named Ferdinand Boccia, an associate he had ordered killed over a dispute involving a rigged card game, Genovese fled the United States. He took $750,000 in cash and settled in the city of Nola, near Naples in Italy. What he did there was remarkable, even by the standards of the men in this story. He cultivated a close relationship with Benito Mussolini's son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano. He donated an estimated $4 million to the Italian Fascist Party. He was awarded the Order of Saints Maurice and Lazarus, a formal Italian state honor. In January 1943, he reportedly approved the murder of an anti-Mussolini journalist named Carlo Tresca, who was shot dead outside his newspaper office in Manhattan. Genovese was running murder operations on American soil from a villa in Italy. When Allied forces arrived in Italy during World War II, Genovese smoothly switched sides. He worked as an interpreter and liaison for the American military, presenting himself as a legitimate businessman. It did not last. An American military investigator named Orange Dickey tracked him down, identified him as a wanted fugitive, and had him extradited back to the United States in 1945. The murder charge that had sent him fleeing 8 years earlier collapsed when the key witness against him died before the trial. Genovese walked free. He spent the late 1940s and early 1950s systematically rebuilding his position. Frank Costello had been running the family in his absence and was now deeply entrenched in New York's political and criminal landscape. Genovese needed Costello gone. He also needed Albert Anastasia gone, because Anastasia and Costello were allied, and Anastasia's capacity for violence made him the most dangerous obstacle between Genovese and total control. On May 2, 1957, Genovese sent a soldier named Vincent Chin Gigante to shoot Costello in the lobby of his apartment building. The bullet grazed Costello's head. He survived. The attempt was enough. Costello, recognizing that his life was now permanently at risk, retired from the organization and ceded power to Genovese. 5 months later, on October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia was shot dead in the Park Sheraton barber chair, with Carlo Gambino's support. Genovese was now the most powerful criminal figure in New York, possibly in the country. He decided to make it official. On November 14, 1957, Genovese organized a summit of Mafia bosses from across the United States at the rural estate of a Pennsylvania crime boss named Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York, a small town near Binghamton in upstate New York. Approximately 100 organized crime figures attended, from cities including New York, Chicago, Buffalo, Tampa, Los Angeles, New Jersey, and beyond.
The agenda included distributing Anastasia's former rackets and consolidating Genovese's authority over the commission. A New York State police sergeant named Edgar Croswell had previously investigated Barbara on suspicion of criminal activity.
He noticed that Barbara's son was reserving large numbers of hotel rooms in the surrounding area, and that a local butcher was delivering an unusually large quantity of meat to the Barbara property. Croswell set up roadblocks around the estate. When the mobsters spotted the police cars, the meeting collapsed into chaos. Dozens of men in expensive suits ran into the woods behind the property. More than 60 were stopped, detained, and identified at the roadblocks. The names of those caught represented a complete directory of American organized crime leadership. The fiction that no national criminal organization existed, a position the FBI had officially maintained for years, was destroyed in an afternoon by one suspicious state trooper and a large meat delivery. The Appalachian disaster forced the FBI to begin seriously pursuing organized crime for the first time. It accelerated a chain of events that led directly to the testimony of Joseph Valachi before the Senate in 1963. The first time a made member of the Mafia publicly confirmed its existence on the record, and eventually to the RICO Act of 1970, which gave prosecutors the tools to dismantle entire criminal organizations rather than prosecuting individual crimes. Some historians believe Luciano, Costello, and Meyer-Lansky may have tipped off police about the Appalachian meeting deliberately to destroy Genovese's power consolidation. None of them were present at the summit. Genovese was convicted of conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws on April 3, 1959, along with 14 co-defendants. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He continued trying to run the Genovese family from his cell at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. His fellow inmate Joseph Valachi, a soldier in his own organization, became convinced that Genovese had marked him for death inside the prison. In 1962, Valachi killed an inmate he mistakenly believed was a Genovese hitman. Then, he became a government witness. Valachi's Senate testimony in 1963 publicly confirmed the structure, rituals, hierarchy, and operations of the American Mafia for the first time in history. It was a catastrophic and irreversible blow. Genovese died of a heart attack on February 14, 1969, at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He had never left prison. The man who wanted to be boss of all bosses ended up being the man who accidentally handed the government the tools to bring the whole institution down. The next case is not about one man's ambition destroying an organization. It is about an entire murder corporation that operated invisibly for over a decade, killing hundreds of people on contract from the back room of a candy store until one witness agreed to talk, and then died under police protection before he could finish testifying. Section 8. Murder Incorporated. The corporate killing machine America didn't know existed. In The Godfather, murder is personal. It is ordered reluctantly, carried out by people with something at stake, and it means something every time it happens. The real killing operation that ran out of Brooklyn from 1929 to 1941 was nothing like that. It was a payroll. It was a roster of employees who showed up, took assignments, completed them, and collected their wages. The men who ran it were not conflicted about any of it. They had simply found a way to industrialize murder and bill it to the National Crime Syndicate as a business expense. Murder Incorporated was established after Lucky Luciano created the Commission in 1931. The Commission needed an enforcement arm, a group that could carry out killings on behalf of the entire syndicate, rather than leaving each family to handle its own violence independently. Luciano placed Louis Lepke Buckhalter and Albert Anastasia in charge of it. Buckhalter handled the business side. Anastasia handled the operations. Together, they built something that had never existed before in American criminal history. The organization was headquartered in a 24-hour candy store called Midnight Roses on Saratoga Avenue in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn.
The store was owned by a mobster named Louis Capone, no relation to Al Capone. Killers from both Jewish and Italian criminal backgrounds were recruited primarily from poor neighborhoods in Manhattan and Brooklyn. They were put on a weekly salary of around $125, a reasonable wage during the Depression era, and told to wait for assignments. When an assignment came, they carried it out. When it was done, they returned to the candy store and waited for the next one. The rules were specific. Never kill in your own neighborhood. Never discuss an assignment before it happens. Never ask why a target has been selected. The men who carried out the killings were deliberately kept ignorant of the political or business reasons behind each murder. They were technicians, not decision-makers. This structure made the organization extraordinarily difficult for law enforcement to penetrate, because the people doing the actual killing genuinely did not know enough to expose the people giving the orders. The operation ran for approximately 10 years. Law enforcement estimates place the number of murders carried out by Murder Inc. at somewhere between 400 and 1,000. The true number will never be known because most of the killings were never connected to the organization, and many victims were never publicly identified. These were not all mob-on-mob killings. The syndicate rented out the organization's services across the country, meaning people died in cities far from Brooklyn at the hands of men who had traveled specifically to kill them and then returned home. The organization was only exposed because one of its most active members decided to cooperate with prosecutors. Abe Relis, known as Kid Twist,
Had personally participated in numerous murders and had detailed knowledge of the organization's operations going back years.
In 1941, he agreed to talk. His testimony was immediate and devastating. It named names, described methods, established chains of command, and gave prosecutors enough material to build cases that sent multiple Murder Inc. members to the electric chair. Louis Buchalter himself was convicted and executed at Sing Sing on March 4, 1944, becoming the only major American organized crime boss ever executed by the state. Albert Anastasia was next. Relis had testimony that directly implicated him. The case against Anastasia was being built around what Relis could put on the record. On November 12, 1941, Abe Relis fell from the 6th-floor window of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. He was in protective custody at the time. 6 police officers were assigned to guard him around the clock. His body was found on a roof extension below his window. No officer was ever criminally charged. The official explanation, that Relis had been attempting to escape using bedsheets tied together, was widely disbelieved at the time and has never been accepted by serious historians since. The most likely explanation, supported by the circumstantial evidence, is that someone with access to the hotel and influence over the officers present arranged for Relis to go out that window. Anastasia was never tried for his role in Murder Inc. He walked free and went on to run his own crime family for another 16 years. The New York police commissioner overseeing the Murder Inc. prosecutions at the time was William O'Dwyer. He was later investigated for his own connections to organized crime. He was never convicted of anything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a man who did not run a murder corporation or lead a crime family.
He did something in many ways more audacious. He killed 2 bosses in a single year, then built an entirely new governing system for organized crime out of the wreckage, and ran it quietly from a prison cell and then a foreign country for the rest of his life. Section 9. The Castellamarese War and Lucky Luciano's double betrayal. How one man killed 2 bosses in 1 year and built an empire. The Godfather is built around the idea that betraying your own boss is the ultimate act of treachery, something that carries consequences so severe that even the most powerful men in the story hesitate before attempting it. In reality,
Lucky Luciano betrayed his boss, had him murdered, made a deal with the new boss, and then had that boss murdered too. He did all of this within 5 months in 1931. Then he built a criminal structure out of the aftermath that has outlasted every government effort to destroy it. To understand what Luciano did, you have to understand what New York's criminal underworld looked like before he did it. By the late 1920s, the city's Italian mob operations were controlled by Giuseppe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, a traditional Sicilian gangster who demanded tribute from every criminal operation in the city and refused to work with anyone who was not Italian. His main rival was Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian don who had been sent to America specifically to challenge Masseria's control. Both men were what younger mobsters called mustache Petes, old-world figures who ran their organizations according to rigid ethnic and cultural codes that made expansion and cooperation with other criminal groups almost impossible. The war between Masseria and Maranzano began on February 26, 1930, and lasted 14 months. Dozens of men were killed on both sides. The conflict was expensive, destabilizing, and bad for business across the entire underworld. Luciano, who was working as one of Masseria's top lieutenants, had already concluded that both bosses were obstacles to the kind of modern, profitable, rationally organized criminal enterprise he wanted to build. He began making plans accordingly. He secretly approached Maranzano with a proposition. He would arrange Masseria's death. In return, he would take over Masseria's rackets and become Maranzano's second-in-command. Maranzano agreed. On April 15, 1931, Luciano took Masseria to dinner at a restaurant called Nuova Via Tamaro in the Coney Island neighborhood of Brooklyn. They ate together and played cards afterward. At a certain point in the evening, Luciano excused himself and went to the bathroom. 4 gunmen entered the restaurant while he was gone. Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Bugsy Siegel, and Joe Adonis shot Masseria dead at the table. The getaway driver, a man named Ciro Terranova, was reportedly too shaken to operate the vehicle. Bugsy Siegel physically removed him from the driver's seat and drove the car away himself. The Castellamarese War ended that night. Maranzano had won. He immediately reorganized New York's criminal gangs into 5 distinct families, each with defined territory and a clear hierarchy of boss, underboss, captains, soldiers, and associates. He declared himself Capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and summoned crime leaders from across the country to a meeting in Wappingers Falls, New York, where he laid out the new structure. He gave Luciano the position he had been promised. Then, Maranzano began planning to kill him. He had come to view Luciano as too ambitious, too connected, and too dangerous to leave alive. He hired an Irish gangster named Vincent Mad Dog Call to carry out the murder. Luciano found out about the contract through his associate, Tommy Lucchese, who had access to Maranzano's inner circle. Luciano moved before Call could. On September 10, 1931, exactly 5 months and 26 days after Masseria's murder, Maranzano summoned Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello to his office on the 9th floor of 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan. Luciano understood the meeting was a death sentence. Rather than attend himself, he sent 4 Jewish gangsters recruited through Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. These men were completely unknown to Maranzano's people. They arrived at the office dressed as government agents, produced badges, and disarmed Maranzano's bodyguards in the waiting room. Lucchese was present to identify Maranzano. The men entered his private office and stabbed him repeatedly before shooting him. Maranzano died on the floor of his own office at 230 Park Avenue. Luciano had now killed 2 bosses in 5 months. He was 33 years old, and there was no one left above him. Rather than take the title of boss of all bosses, which had now contributed to 2 men being murdered in rapid succession, he abolished it. He called a meeting in Chicago and proposed the Commission instead, a governing board of the major American crime families designed to prevent future wars and resolve disputes through negotiation rather than bloodshed. The original commission included 7 family bosses. It was, in practical terms, the moment American organized crime stopped being a collection of warring gangs and became a functioning national institution. The final case in this series is about the single day that institution was forced out of the shadows forever, when nearly 100 of the most powerful criminals in America gathered in rural upstate New York and were caught by one suspicious police sergeant who noticed an unusually large meat delivery. Section 10. The Appalachian Summit Disaster. The day the Mafia exposed itself to America. For decades, the American Mafia operated behind a simple and extraordinarily effective defense: official denial. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI for 48 years, maintained for most of his tenure that there was no such thing as a national organized crime network in the United States. Whether he genuinely believed this or had his own reasons for avoiding the subject has been debated by historians ever since. What is not debated is that on November 14, 1957, that official position became impossible to sustain. Not because of a years-long federal investigation or a major informant operation, because approximately 100 of the most powerful criminals in America drove to a farmhouse in upstate New York and got caught by a single state police sergeant who thought something looked wrong about a meat delivery. The meeting was organized by Vito Genovese. He had just overseen the murder of Albert Anastasia in October 1957 and had forced Frank Costello into retirement through an assassination attempt 5 months earlier. He was now the dominant figure in New York's criminal landscape and wanted to use a national summit to formalize that position, distribute Anastasia's former rackets among the families, and consolidate his authority over the commission. The location chosen was the rural estate of Joseph Barbara, a Pennsylvania crime boss who lived in the small town of Appalachian near Binghamton in upstate New York. Barbara had hosted smaller gatherings before without incident. The assumption was that a remote rural property in a quiet town would attract no attention. New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell had been keeping an informal eye on Barbara for several years, suspecting him of criminal activity without having enough to act on. In the days before the November 14th meeting, Croswell noticed 2 things. Barbara's son was reserving unusually large numbers of hotel rooms in the surrounding area, and a local butcher was delivering an exceptionally large quantity of meat to the Barbara property. Croswell contacted a colleague from the Treasury Department's Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Unit named Arthur Rustin, and the 2 men set up surveillance and roadblocks on the roads leading to and from the estate. When the mobsters at the meeting spotted the police presence, the gathering disintegrated immediately. Men in expensive suits and dress shoes ran into the woods behind the property. Others attempted to drive away and were stopped at the roadblocks. More than 60 people were detained and identified. The names on that list represented a comprehensive cross-section of American organized crime leadership. Bosses, underbosses, and senior figures from New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Buffalo, Tampa, Los Angeles, Cleveland, and multiple other cities were all placed at the same location on the same afternoon. Among those stopped were Vito Genovese himself, Carlo Gambino, Joseph Bonanno, Santo Trafficante Jr., and Carlo Marcello. The men detained represented virtually every major organized crime organization operating in the United States at the time. The criminal charges filed against those arrested were ultimately thrown out. The courts ruled that detaining the men simply for being present at a private gathering, without evidence of a specific crime being committed, did not meet the legal standard required. Nobody went to prison as a direct result of Appalachian, but the damage to the Mafia was not legal. It was institutional. The public exposure of that many senior organized crime figures gathered in one place made it factually impossible for the FBI or any other law enforcement agency to continue claiming that no national criminal organization existed. Hoover was forced to formally acknowledge the reality of organized crime and establish a dedicated program to investigate it. Congressional pressure increased immediately. The public now knew, with certainty, that the men running illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and murder operations across the country were not isolated local criminals, but part of a connected national structure. The Appalachian disaster accelerated everything that followed. Joseph Valachi,
Sitting in a federal prison cell in 1962 and convinced that Genovese wanted him dead, became a government witness and testified before the Senate in 1963, the first made member of the American Mafia to publicly confirm its existence and describe its internal workings on the record. His testimony fed directly into the political pressure that produced the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act in 1970, the RICO Act, which gave federal prosecutors the ability to charge entire criminal organizations rather than just individual crimes. The commission trial of 1985 and 1986, which resulted in the bosses of all 5 New York families being convicted and sentenced to 100-year prison terms, was a direct product of that legal framework. All of it traces back to one afternoon in a small town in upstate New York, where a police sergeant noticed that someone had ordered too much meat. Genovese had spent 30 years building toward total control of American organized crime. He achieved it for approximately 3 weeks before a roadblock on a rural New York road began the chain of events that would dismantle the institution he had given his life to. The Godfather ends with Michael Corleone in complete control, the doors closing around him, his power absolute and his future unquestioned. The real Mafia bosses who inspired that story ended up dead in barber chairs, beaten to death in prison cells, shot in their own basements by men they trusted, or sitting in courtrooms watching 100-year sentences get handed down one after another. The myth was always cleaner than the reality. The reality was always worse. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.